So, so you had, Emily, you had this sort of breakthrough where you said, I'm going to love and celebrate my husband, and I'm going to put this in God's hands, and he'll figure it out in the eternities. And you started listening to podcasts. And that's another thing. Refer people to this podcast or other podcasts. A Thoughtful Faith, Mormon Matters, Bill Reel on Mormon Dialogue or Mormon Discussions. He's got a new series called Marriage on a Tightrope or Marriage on a High Wire or something like that. There are lots of options for podcasts that deal with this mixed faith marriage thing. Mormon Stories, if you go to Mormon Stories menu, there's actually a menu option where you can just filter in the episodes about faith crises, about couples, about mixed faith couples. Check those out. Share them with your spouse, your believing spouse, your non-believing spouse, extended family, because these are podcasts you can listen to together and share with others. So, all right, what's next in your journey?
Yeah, so...
It's baptism.
Yeah, get into that.
Okay.
But from my perspective, so I wasn't on the phone. I don't remember, obviously... I don't know that you shared initially that conversation you had with your mom, whenever that was. But I can tell you that when Emily started listening to John, to your podcasts, that was a bright line sea change in our marriage. Prior to that, we were living on the other side of Houston, and Emily had a lot of good friends, all of them ward member, active Mormons, and they were kind of aware generally that while I was still going to church, I wasn't participating, or had lost my faith. But either they didn't have the tools to know how to ask the questions of Emily to have a conversation, or Emily didn't feel comfortable talking to them, but there was no community for Emily to latch on to either listen or to vent or to talk about what was happening between us until your podcasts. And I would put that around 2010, 2011. And I just remember you were still very active in the church, but once you got onto these podcasts, you were listening to a podcast every day or every other day.
Clean toilets and fold laundry and listen to podcasts.
She was on fire listening to these podcasts because she was finally listening to other stories where, wouldn't you know it, there are actually people out there like us trying to navigate these issues, and we're not alone. And so for me, that was huge. And that was in the same time frame, I think, John, where I met you for the first time. Emily found out you were coming to Houston for an event, and we met you at someone's home where you put on a podcast. And I remember thanking you then, back in 2011, kind of along these same lines. Around that same time, our son was about to turn 8, and I needed to make a decision about whether I was going to baptize my son. Now, I had baptized my daughter, my oldest, in 2008, even though my faith was dead as a doornail. I was still checking the boxes and going to church so I could kind of get away with it. Not that that's the right thing to do. But when it came time for my son's baptism, I took a different approach, and I think in large part because you allowed me to. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't, it was a gradual situation, but Emily began to start to accept me and, all of me, my lack of belief, for who I was. And I felt like I was beginning to be able to be authentic and not to be a disappointment by being myself. And I think that gave me the confidence, because you gave me the license to be authentic, where I made a very big decision in 2012 and made the decision that I was not going to baptize my son. Because I don't believe this. I haven't believed it for over a decade. I would be doing my son a disservice. It doesn't make any sense, and I'm tired of pretending to just go along with the current. And that was not an easy decision. The easier decision was 4 years earlier with my daughter when I just kind of faked it and nobody asked any questions. But with my son, I remember calling my mom, and I had two things to tell her. The first one was because she was planning to come with her husband to my son's baptism, and I had to tell her that I'd made the decision that I'm not going to baptize my son. And basically what I told her was, at the time I was 35 or so, I said, Mom, I'm done making decisions in the church based on what I perceive other people want me to do. And I've got to follow my conscience and make decisions on based what I think is right. And I think the right decision here is for me not to baptize my son. And she, it was a difficult conversation, but she told me she loved me. And the second thing that I wanted to ask her on the call was, I didn't really have anybody to fill in for me. And so I asked her, and I asked her husband, Kirk, if he would come down to Houston and perform the baptism. And he did. He was very gracious, and it was awesome. But it was almost a coming out party for me, in a sense, where I no longer had to pretend to be someone that I wasn't. I could take that shirt off that was a few sizes too small, and I could be myself. So I attended the baptism. I think I said the opening prayer, but that was the extent of my participation. And it was really beautiful. It was really beautiful, and I had the full support of Emily. Mm-hmm. And so, but that was only a year or so after Emily started listening to your podcasts. I mean, we came that far in a year's time where I was suddenly able to be myself, and she was appreciating and loving me unconditionally. It was beautiful.
And Ty's baptism was beautiful. It was focused on Ty. If there was any drama because Kyle wasn't doing it, I didn't feel it. It was a beautiful baptism for Ty.
And it's a tiny bit crazy that sometimes religion gets in the way of unconditional love. Like, you would think that at its core, the core A1 zero base level requirement for religion is unconditional love of our fellow man, woman, and especially of our spouses and our children and our immediate family. But unconditional love sometimes takes us decades to figure out. It's kind of crazy. Really quickly, Kyle, you talked about early on how hard it was to go 5 or 7 years faking it. What does it do to you to go 10 years faking it? What does that do to you? You talked about the shirt being too small and feeling suffocated. What does it do to your psyche, your psychology, your mental health over time to be inauthentic and to fake it for so long? What's that like for your health?
It's deflating. It's not, and again, it was every Sunday for me because I was in the nursery, so I was not really asked to do much. So it was just those Sunday meetings. But it was, looking back, sometimes I wonder how I did it, but it was difficult and painful and frustrating, all of those things. But, in our story, it was worth it. So I'm glad I'm glad I did it. Glad I wore that shirt, because that, as we've talked about, for us, the foundation was there, and I didn't even think that it was a possibility to throw that foundation away. So for me, it was worth the pain and the probably mental anguish to have to pretend and to fake it. Now, around this 2012 timeframe, and really, we moved from where we were living on the other side of Houston to where we are now in 2013. So same city, but different side of the city. Houston's a big place, so it was a move.
Can I jump in for just
Sure.
1 second? There are a lot of people that once they lose their faith, the idea of their kids getting baptized causes panic. They're thinking church isn't true. I don't want them exposed to it. I don't want them on the records. I don't want them being followed and harassed throughout their lives. And they have this fear of, like, I don't want them becoming true believers and then becoming missionaries and then thinking I'm broken and sad and defective. Talk about, like, even a listener just asked, how in the world could you have let your kids to be baptized once you knew it wasn't true?
Yeah.
And you guys smiled at each other there.
Yeah.
What was going on there?
So I'd known or believed it wasn't true for a long time. So 2012, I'd come to that conclusion about a decade earlier. But for me, and I think we kind of got to the same place eventually, for a long time I worried about, well, in a mixed faith marriage, what do we teach our kids? Right? I mean, do I come in guns blazing and tell them everything I know and say, you know what, that story about the first vision, that was actually written 18 years after the fact, and there are 3 other versions that are wildly different. No. I made the decision I was not going to
Ruffle feathers.
Proactively destroy my children's testimony as they were developing in the church. Rather, for me, what made more sense was, Emily is a believing member. I respect that. The Mormon Church is a fine church. I don't believe it's true. It's the one true church, but a lot of good people are products of the Mormon Church. So I was okay with continuing to attend and allowing my children to continue to attend. And where we came out on it was, look, as soon as our children get old enough where they start being sophisticated enough to ask questions, as soon as they get old enough to start noticing that dad doesn't believe the same way that mom does, I think the conclusion we came to was, if my daughter came to me and asked me whether I believed the church was true, I would be honest with her. And I probably wouldn't tell her everything, but I'd tell her as much as I felt like she could handle for that age and that mental state. And then I would finish that discussion with, that's what I think. Your mom has a different belief set, and you need to talk and listen to your mother. But ultimately, when you get older, it's up to you to decide what you believe, because it doesn't do any good to force religion on people or force belief on people, because ultimately they're going to have to make up their own mind anyway. And so for me, getting back to your question, I was okay with Ty getting baptized. I didn't believe the church was true, but Emily did, and I respect that. And eventually, my plan was and has been to have conversations with my son about the church and feed him information while not being overbearing, and eventually allow him to make up his own mind. That's a gift that I think I was not given growing up, that I want to give to my kids, is the gift of choice and support.
So many of the people that I work with, they start panicking, and they want to resign from the church, they want to pull out, they want to stop going to church, and they want to yank the kids out. Or, kids are 7 years old and they want to tell them about polyandry and Book of Abraham and papyri. It's a natural reaction. It's super common. So we laugh at it, but it's just so common. It sounds like you, Kyle, wanted to take the long game, but I'm imagining that required a certain temperament that not everyone has, and a lot of patience and faith that things would kind of reconcile in the end, that you wouldn't come out the loser. But you know, the 14 years is one of the pulls to this episode, but I think your long game was an important part of the success. And Emily, tell me why you're nodding, Emily.
Well, I agree. It was his approach. Number one, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was a devoted husband and father, and basically, you know, things were good. But number two, that he's super reasonable and not dramatic in that sense. And he's, you know, a good parent would understand not to inundate, although some could argue I was inundating on the other end, but he just kept a fair distance and kept the peace. I commend you for that in the process. That it was mature, it was reasonable. And Kyle, you mentioned the canoe analogy that I've talked about in previous podcasts, where if the kids are in the middle of the canoe and one stands up and starts screaming, meaning the church is not true, there's a shark, you know, the other, like you said, is going to buckle down and brace down and double down, like you said, Emily. Emily, would you say it's true that when the opposite happens, when he chills out, when he just let go, that made you feel what in terms of your comfort level and your willingness to investigate? Well, he was willing to, he was never pulling the kids aside to change anyone's mind. You know, I think maybe that approach also came from your dad and your brother. It was to each their own. You're going to figure this out at some point. There's no rush. We're just going to be over here. He's just going to be over there being honest with them and hoping that our kids will come to him to seek advice at some point. He's not going to shove it down their throats. So I think, you know, that was just his approach.
What I've seen is the calmer the non-believing spouse can be, and the more safe they make their partner feel, then that believing partner is willing to learn and at least empathize with and study what the concerns are and become more informed. And the goal isn't to get the believing spouse to stop believing, but the goal is for there to be strong emotional intimacy and respect between the couple. And that happens when the believer is willing to look at the evidence and the issues from the perspective of the non-believer, and then reach this point where they can look to their partner and say, I get it. I get why you left. You're not broken. You're not bad. But in reality, this was an act of courage and integrity for you. And in some bizarre way, even though I'm a believer, I respect you for you doing what you felt was right. Did any of that apply to
Certainly.
you guys?
And I think I started to realize that beliefs are so personal. And I think in Mormondom specifically, we get up and we talk about how much we know the church is true, and we know, and we share our beliefs more so in hindsight now that I'm out and I've, you know, live in religious conservative Texas and have a lot of Christian of other faiths, other denominations, Catholic friends. It is fascinating to observe them and realize how different each other's, you know, spouses' beliefs are, even in their family, and that's just personal. And I just feel like in Mormonism there was so much of sharing our beliefs that therefore, if you're anything but those of those same beliefs, then that makes everybody uncomfortable. And instead of valuing someone's personal faith belief or journey, or even their journey out of Mormonism, you know, it's valued less so in Mormonism. It's hard for people to value that in Mormonism. I just looked at him, and I was finally able to say, good for you, to each their own. And what you're able to, what you believe and what you wrap your mind around is almost none of my business. I started to get to that point, which is really hard for someone in Mormonism to do, because we are each other's business, and that's going to affect eternity. And specifically, we get so specific in Mormonism to a certain tier. Like, I've gone down. I'm no longer in the celestial. If you're not with me, I get it. So what? As long as I'm with you, that's better than nothing. But I just valued his personal approach.
So what was happening to your faith during this transition?
It was just broadening. I'm going to use a quote. It's from Aristotle, and it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it, which was something I couldn't do initially with my small, non-critical thinking mind when we were so young. And like I said, I was just doing mind-numbing tasks. That was the wall that I put up, is I just don't have to accept that.
Or that if you entertain this piece of information
that
I'm telling you, you must accept it.
Yeah, that it's going to become my thought as well. So I kind of approached it with kind of a clean slate, like, what do I believe in about Mormonism? And let me dig deep. All these issues that Kyle brought to me and I kept at bay were now being presented by multiple like-minded people in not just Mormon Stories podcast, multiple. A Year of Polygamy with Lindsay Hansen Park, and Dan Witherspoon's Mormon Matters. And these were exposing me to thoughts that you'd brought to me that I wouldn't entertain. And so I was now I was sorting through those on my own, still separate from him. And I did that on my own, just day after day after day. And then we moved up here to the Woodlands. So if we want to start going down that road, I think the cultural...
Is there anything we missed that you want
to... Just one point to circle back to what you were saying earlier during your last coaching timeout. You said, I think that if the non-believing spouse can calm down, that does wonders for the believing spouse. And that's true. I think though it's more dynamic than that. It's not static, in that I can speak from the non-believing side. The more Emily allowed me to be authentic and to not judge me for it, the more I calmed down. So it was cyclical, right? I mean, she was loving me for who I am and unconditionally, that calmed me down. And so it cut both ways. But that was, once I started to feel loved and like I could be myself and we were going to be good, that's when things started to get good. So much
of the anger and desperation and frankly depression and mental illness comes from living inauthentically. Living inauthentically is toxic to mental health. And if you find yourself angry, or if you find your non-believing spouse angry, if you find yourself depressed and suffocated, chances are it's because you haven't come out to all the people you need to come out to, and you're living almost suffocating in a box. It's like a cardboard box. The sun is beating down, and you're in a box. And that's a great point.
So anyway, moving to the Woodlands, we were going to talk about what that did for you.
Yeah, so, Kyle talked about good friends, that they were more my friends back in Pearland, ward members. So for the first time, we moved away from them and didn't have, instant friends here in the Woodlands. So it was kind of a fresh start for me, I would say, culturally in Mormonism. While now I was kind of diving deep into, what do I really believe doctrinally in Mormonism, and sorting those things out. I was also leaving, maybe the pressure to conform and be an active believing member, just with, friendships and daily run-ins with my good friends whom I love and adore. And we got up here to the Woodlands, and the first, we rented a home for 1 year, and then we purchased a home the next year. And so that put us in 2 different wards in the Woodlands just because of boundaries. And the first ward we went to, it was greeted by, the welcoming into the ward. They send someone from the Relief Society presidency to greet you. And the Relief Society member they sent was a dear friend who was instrumental in my continuing to dive deep in Mormonism, in this new Mormonism that I was, I've kind of, changed my tune, and I was ready to start fresh and look at it in a different lens, right?
And how did you guys identify each other? How did either of you feel safe or get a clue that the other was questioning?
Good question. So when she came to my home, I had a coffee table book, an Obama picture book, and she said something it kind of I thought was snide, like, "Ooh, Obama, we're in conservative Texas, and I'm a Mormon, so why in the world would I have Obama?" That's at least the way I took it, and so I think I pushed back a little bit, thinking, "Oh, she's coming to my home, talking about Obama," and I just said something about us being progressive, and it was instant. We both were listening to Mormon Stories podcasts.
Coincidentally.
Yes.
Your visiting teacher.
Well, the Relief Society representative.
Okay.
And we didn't go into much detail because, of course, there was a companion with her. But it was we should meet at the door when we parted ways. We should maybe go to lunch. And from then on, it was, Starbucks, in fact. At least once a week, maybe twice a week for hours on end. And then she and her husband became close, and we'd go out on weekends. But she was what I couldn't allow Kyle to do for me. And I still, even though I was certainly, accepting of his position and where he was at, it was just helpful to go through that with someone who's experiencing the same things at the same moment. And so she and I would talk for hours. She was, a light in this, and we could just bounce things off of each other and we were believing members at the time, both of us. We were just learning lots of things that wasn't our understanding of Mormonism before in this internet era. And so that we spent a lot of good time together. And we became, I told Kyle, for the friends that I've had that took, 10 years to make these long-lasting life relationships with, she and I are at that phase after year 1, just because of the deep conversations that we would have. So you get to know someone pretty quickly and pretty intimately when you're talking about faith crises, and she was instrumental to that. She moved away, unfortunately, after about a year and a half, but we're still good friends, and that was helpful to me in a way that I wouldn't allow him to be helpful to me.
Beautiful. Okay. So Kyle, what's it like for you to have her listening to Mormon Stories all the time, and now finding people in the Relief Society that feel the same way she does, and to see her wheels start turning? What was that like for you?
It was almost like a dream, right? I mean, I'd been hoping that, I don't know what I was hoping for, but I was hoping for full connection for so long. And her, with this friend she had and the podcasts, it just allowed us to complete that connection where we hadn't been able to for so long. Around the same time, the essays, the church started to publish, not dated or not signed by anyone, but they'd publish these essays on their website. And, for the first time, we were reading these, and she was still a believing member, but she let me in, right? Like previously, every time we discussed religion, it was an argument. And we started looking at these essays, and we were reading them together. And there was no contention, so suddenly we were starting to react to these essays almost as a team. And, she texts me at work, and, they just published the Blacks and the Priesthood essay, and we, come home and read it at night together. And that was really kind of beautiful. Not that the essays were necessarily beautiful, but the fact that she was letting me in, and now it was kind of her journey, right? It was the beginnings of her faith crisis, and I was able to have a shotgun front row seat to help her through that. So 180 degrees. It was beautiful. Something that people forget so often when the coaching moment, when religion seems like it's the main problem in a relationship, the truth is the problem is a lack of emotional intimacy. And when there's a discrepancy in belief or in faith, it seems like the problem is that, you believe different things. But the real problem is you both see the world so differently, and you're both so scared or angry or emotional that you stop connecting emotionally, talking about things, sharing your feelings, being vulnerable, having unconditional love, making each other feel completely loved and accepted, being best friends, having fun together. The emotional intimacy dies, and that's what really jeopardizes the relationship. And so what I hear you guys say is that it wasn't so much that, the marriage gets better because she's losing her faith, even though that's kind of how people might be interpreting this. My perception, as I hear this after the fact, is the marriage is getting better because they were talking about things. They were sharing things. They were being vulnerable and exploring together and kind of having this engaging, intellectual and emotional and spiritual quest and engagement, and they're doing it together. And I loved what you said, Emily, about it's not that the believer has to stop believing. It's not that the believer has to change their point of view. That's not the goal. The goal is for the couple to go on this intellectual and spiritual journey together and to benefit from the exchanges of vulnerability, of sharing, of openness, of intellectual intrigue, of communication. And that's what strengthens the marriage. I 100% agree. And during this period, I don't want to paint the picture that I was rooting for her to leave. I was not. As long as as long as the church was healthy for her, and we'll get to that, because towards the end, I was telling her that, I saw the pain that she was going through, and I told her that it was like she was, banging her head into a cinder block wall over and over and over again, and I felt that wasn't good for her health or mentally. But at the time, I was just glad to be, like you said, to be a part of it. And if that, meant that she stayed in, and at this point in time, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, Emily has always been, she has just a dynamic personality. She's a leader, and whatever she touches, she's able to affect change. She's able to, people listen to her. What she says is impactful. And so during this period, she was having these questions and entertaining these historical issues, but she was also continuing to make change for good in the church. And I saw that, and so I didn't have a rooting interest for her to leave. And John, the reason for that probably was she at this point I could be myself. So there was no judgment on her part for my lack of belief. And so as soon as I had that, I wasn't threatened by her continued, as long as it was what she sincerely believed and she felt like it was the right thing, I was fully behind it.
In fact, you told your dad and brother she'll never leave. Even though she, they
Yeah.
would say, oh,
And
Emily seems to be pretty progressive.
And I was completely comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way to be. And it's also, and I know I'm interjecting a lot, but I coach people, and so I'm trying to just give people the support they need. You want your believing spouse to go on their own journey, and you don't want to let them read their own books, talk to their own friends. They're going to get a lot farther if they're if you're not the teacher, because nobody wants to marry their dad, no one wants to marry their child, no one wants to marry anything other than their lover. And so don't become the teacher to your spouse. Let them go on their own self-guided learning journey, and to use other friends or other sources or other books or other websites when they're ready in their own time, instead of you feeling like that's up to you. Okay, so how do you guys want to kind of, where do you guys want to take us next?
Well, so when we moved to this ward, I was also ready to be authentic in the fact that I had a disbelieving spouse who was still attending church with our family. And so we were in our new ward, and I met with the bishop, and I let him know that this was our family. This is, Kyle attends with us, but he is a non-believer. We're married in the temple, and this is where we're at now. Because typically when you get into a ward, you get asked to talk as a couple. And I said, to this bishop, I don't know if you have, plans to ask us to speak, but I'd still love to speak. And specifically, I'd like to speak on the topic of, an article of faith that's been, talked about in our home as of late. And so what I wanted to share next is this talk I gave in our first ward when we first moved to the Woodlands. Again, we go to a second ward later, about a year later. And I was called, in that first ward I was called into Young Women's. Jaden was in Young Women's, so I was super thrilled about that, to still be with her in Young Women's. So I was called to Young Women's, and I was given this opportunity to give a talk. And I knew how I wanted to give this talk in this new ward in order for our family to, come in with our warts exposed and to worship authentically in a ward family. And I thought the best way to do that was to share our story. And so I used the impetus for this story was started with the Article of Faith 11. Let's see if I can remember it. We claim the privilege of worshiping the Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience. We allow all others the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may.
Nice.
Yes. My point in, I had an agenda, and it was to remind Mormons that we memorize this and we preach it and we apparently believe it as an article of faith that we believe in, but we don't live it very well. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I did not live this when, it applied to my own spouse, which was that I didn't let him worship how, where, or what he may. That was an issue. And, at that time I've
never thought about applying that to a Mormon marriage.
Yeah.
But why not?
Yeah. Or any person who questions within Mormonism. That was kind of my point, is that, we tend to generally, I'm not speaking for everybody in Mormonism, but we tend to generally turn our backs on those who question. They're a threat, and it's scary, and we fear it because we don't understand it. And we've been told to, stay away from non-believers from the top down. And so my message was, I think I started off with reminding everyone that Joseph Smith at one point wasn't Mormon. He believed in something else at one point. And so did the rest of his family. They were going to multiple different congregations, Methodist, Baptist, and until he created Mormonism. So I started with that, and then I'm trying to summarize, I think what was great is Elder Uchtdorf at that time had come out with, for so long there have been reasons why people leave the Mormon Church. Well, they wanted to sin, the myths as to why they leave, and they wanted to sin, or they were having an affair, or they wanted to drink alcohol. Help me out. There's all these reasons it couldn't be that they actually don't believe it to be true, or the truth claims to be true. Or that, there are some uncomfortable truths about our history. And so I can't remember Uchtdorf's quote, but he was finally giving permission to look at these mistakes that were being made by church leaders, and they weren't pretty. And we have a bunch of them. And he also was speaking to why some Mormons leave. And it was unprecedented, and it was nothing like I'd ever heard before. So that was great. And I used that in the talk. And then I got down to telling our story, which I almost didn't tell our personal story, because I thought, what I was preaching could stand on its own, kind of asking Mormons to take their own medicine and to not turn our backs on our loved ones, but like I did. And it was Kyle who nudged me to say, you know what, just as a reminder, you could have used someone to tell this story, and from the pulpit, there's not a forum for, me to have had, that experience, or to share, like we've already talked about that. So I lost my train of thought with the water bottle exchange. So
you told our story.
So I ended up telling our story. And the highlights of that, were after so much time, I just decided to love Kyle, not based upon the condition that he was Mormon, and based on unconditional love, that I just loved him, and that was enough. And that he was following his own personal, journey, and that was beautiful, and mine is beautiful, going this way, and his is beautiful, and that should be valued. And I was just championing our situation, I guess, in some ways. And then I went on to talk about our kids, same type of approach. Mom believes X, dad believes Y, and your job is to find out what you believe. Am I missing some of the highlights of that? And so that felt really, I think you could have heard a pin drop. It was not your traditional Mormon talk up at the pulpit, introducing our family to the ward. But I told everybody that he was no longer a believer, that we met at Rick's college, and I expected him to be. We were married in the temple, and he's left, and so here we are. Accept us, take us, if you'll have us. And I remember finishing, and the bishop got up and, kind of, I think it was uncomfortable enough that he felt like he needed to advocate for Kyle a little bit, which was sweet. And he just said, I've met Kyle, he's a great guy. And, I agree, we need to allow those to worship how, where, and what they may. But what happened after that is the amount of people that came up to me afterwards in tears, multiple people in tears. And there was kind of a line, people waiting to have an opportunity. I mean, immediately after that meeting ended, people came directly up to shake my hand, and they were kind, and the people that I ran into were sweet about it. And even days after that, it was, and I'm only saying that because I really think people resonated with it. And, one person told me her mom didn't believe, and that was the first time she'd ever felt, comfortable in a church setting, or I'm thinking of other people. That everybody knew someone, right? Like there's
no forum within the church structure for that type of a discussion. And so I think when Emily gave that talk and she was vulnerable and said, basically told the story that we've told today, and then said how we, at the time, how we were navigating things, I think people are, to use your word, desert thirsty, but there's no community, there's no forum, which is why, John, what you do is so important, because there are people that need to know that there's a community and need to be able to tell their story and listen to other people's stories. It's healthy, it's therapeutic, and it's critical, but there isn't a structure set up, unless things have changed since I last attended, to do it.
Yeah, and I just have to say, it's so bizarre if you really think about it, how what you did, Emily, was so basic. All you did was tell your story and just say, this is what happened to us. This is what happened to Kyle. This is what happened to me. And that in a Mormon context is a radical act.
Yeah.
It's an outrageous, risky, scary, revolutionary act in a Mormon context to simply be authentic.
Yeah. Oh, no, I felt radical.
And all you did was tell your story.
Yeah. No, I felt
It's
nervous.
like you burned a bra or like
Yeah.
punched somebody, right?
Yeah.
All you did was speak your truth, and that's revolutionary.
Well, to give you an example, a friend who sat through that, I wasn't close to her, but she was in Young Women's with me. She thought the bishop was going to get up. She caught me afterwards, and she said, I thought he was going to get up and rebuke you, and I was ready to walk out. I don't really even know her that well, but her, reaction was like, oh my gosh, and I hope he doesn't get up and, rebuke her for that talk. And he didn't.
To his credit.
Yeah.
Because others might have. Could have had a Savannah moment where they shut off the microphone,
Yes,
right?
right.
Ask you to sit down.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a call to those who are active Mormons. Tell your story. Not because you want a certain outcome, but because look how many people lined up and said, I'm suffering too. So many people in this religion are suffering in silence. And all they want to hear is just somebody be authentic. And it can save a life. It can transform a life. It can save a marriage. And it can literally save a life.
Well, and now I'm going to get selfish. I had other motives as well. And that was to create a safe space for my children to attend that Ward family. They're inevitably, their dad wasn't, potentially could stop attending. He still was attending with us at that time. They might go home with their dad after sacrament meeting and may not hit up every meeting, just, to kind of keep the peace and to be reasonable. They may not, they will do better in Mormonism with that understanding, with everybody knowing who they are and who their family is and where they come from and the basic background of their family, which is something we did not have back in our previous wards. And I'm not saying that's anyone's fault. I should have gotten up and told that story in other wards. Everybody should tell their story and be open about it. But so it was to create a safe environment for me and the kids.